Hi, I'm Eugene Meyer, President of the Federalist Society, and want to welcome you to the second day of our two-day COVID-19 in the Law Conference. We had an excellent first day, and the two things, the full bios of all the participants are available on our website, fedsoc.org, as are the recordings of the earlier panels, and will be the panels today. So I just wanted to let you all know that. And our first panels are on elections in the law, and to moderate that panel, I want to turn things over to our moderator, Justice Pat DeWine of the Ohio Supreme Court. Justice DeWine.
Great, thanks, Gene. It's great to be here and do this. This really should be a fun topic. There's a lot here. We had primary elections moved this spring. If things get bad this fall, we'll be looking at the same thing. What happens then in the presidential election? Issues about ballot access. We've had lawsuits in Ohio about electronic signature gathering, and should that be allowed so people can get on? And then, of course, there's a whole issue of mail-in ballots, ballot security that goes with that. Is that a good idea? We're going to have a presidential election where we don't know who the president is for weeks after the election. And underlying all these issues are really some interesting and fundamental questions about our federal system. Ultimately, who should make these decisions? States? After all, these are decisions about the time, place, and manner of elections. Or is there a federal role here? And within that, is it the executive branch? The executive branch is kind of taking the lead on a lot of these COVID decisions thus far. But should these be legislative decisions, or what's the role of the courts? I think these are some really fascinating issues, and we have a great panel to talk about them. As Gene said, all their bio. The great thing about these online video conferences, everything is available online. So I'm not going to read all their bios, but let me just give a brief introduction. Michael Morley's a professor at Florida State University Law School, where he teaches and writes in the areas of election law, constitutional law, remedies in the federal courts. He's done work in areas that include election emergencies and post-election litigation. He's been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, published in many of the nation's top law reviews. Prior to becoming an academic, he was assistant to the general counsel of the Army, a law clerk on the 11th Circuit, and an attorney at Williams and Conley and at Winston Strawn. He's a graduate of Yale Law School. Rick Pildes is one of the nation's leading scholars on constitutional law and a specialist in issues concerning democracy. He's a former law clerk to Justice Thurgood Marshall. He's been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Science and the American Law Institute. His work explores legal and policy issues concerning the structure of democratic elections institutions, things like money in politics, the design of election districts, the regulation of political parties, and representation of minority interest in democratic institutions. Brad Smith holds the Josiah H. Blackmore Shirley M. Null Professor of Law position at Capital University Law School. He is one of the nation's leading experts in the country on election law. His case book on the topic has been published widely and used extensively. We often see Brad opining on elections matters on our TV screens. He served as a member of the Federal Elections Commission. He's a graduate of Kalamazoo College and Harvard Law School. And finally, Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on issues of rule of law, security, and governance in post-conflict countries, fragile states, and states in transitions. She was appointed by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to serve on the Foreign Affairs Policy Board. She's consulted on law reform issues for the World Bank, the European Union, the OECD, and many others. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kick things off with some introductory remarks, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. I'd remind people who wish to ask a question that if you're on your computer, you can simply, if you're on Zoom, you can just simply raise your hand, or if you're on your phone, press *9. Michael, do you want to kick things off?
Great. Thank you very much. And I'd like to also thank everyone for joining us in this Zoom conference. So when we think about what I call election emergencies, the impact of things like natural disasters, public health crises, global pandemics, even terrorist attacks, if you think back to 9/11, which happened on the day of the New York State primaries, the main question is, how do we ensure that every legally eligible voter has a reasonable chance to cast a ballot without unduly endangering their health? And there's three separate levels at which this issue arises. The first is under the General Election Code, that just the ordinary laws that govern the electoral process often give election officials discretion to take certain measures, to exercise their judgment in terms of how best to respond to unexpected emergencies. Many states, and one of the things that we've been seeing as we've been watching the primaries unfold, is that there is tremendous variation among states with regard to what I call election emergency laws. These are laws that allow election officials to depart from the ordinary election code that typically would govern the electoral process, that gives them special discretion that they can exercise under certain circumstances. And state laws in this respect vary widely. In some states, the only power that election officials have is to simply postpone an election, which would not be a particularly helpful response to a global pandemic where moving an election a few days later isn't really going to alleviate the underlying concerns. Other states allow election officials to suspend rules or modify rules concerning things like absentee ballots or who's eligible to request absentee ballots. In some situations, signature requirements or witness requirements for absentee ballots. And so one of the historically overlooked aspects of the electoral system that the COVID crisis has been driving public attention to is election emergency laws. To what extent do states have laws that allow them to survive these types of electoral crises? And then the final and most extreme layer at which you can assess this is general state of emergency statutes, that many, though not all states, allow their governors to simply suspend any state laws or any state statutory deadlines during a declared emergency when the governor, in his or her discretion, determines that complying with those statutes or complying with those deadlines would undermine or hinder or jeopardize the response to that crisis. And so in some situations, we've seen governors exercising their authority to simply suspend parts of the election code altogether in order to be able to respond to COVID with regard to the crisis that we've been seeing. For jurisdictions that are not able to address an election emergency at any of these levels, whether through their ordinary election code, election emergency laws, or their general state of emergency law, the obvious fallback, of course, is constitutional litigation. Most of the constitutional cases that have arisen challenging various aspects of the primary processes where election officials have been unable on their own to modify them have either been equal protection type claims, saying that the right to vote is being unconstitutionally burdened for some voters but not others, or simply straightforward right to vote claims, saying that the burdens that particular voters are facing are simply unduly substantial, that they're not warranted by any legitimate state interests, that even though in general certain requirements, such as a deadline, such as a witness requirement or a signature requirement, even though in general courts have upheld those requirements, in general they might not pose substantial burdens, in the unique context of an election emergency such as COVID, they might pose unexpected challenges. And so in an as-applied challenge, in election restrictions that in general would go unquestioned are in some cases being suspended or modified. One of the really important things to consider with regard to constitutional litigation, many of these cases are being adjudicated on a very rushed basis by their very nature, right? We're seeing TROs, we're seeing motions for preliminary injunctions, particularly earlier on where elections were occurring within a few days or weeks of the COVID crisis really becoming a national problem. One of the things to bear in mind is for judges adjudicating these cases, it's not just a binary on-off. They can either enjoin the challenged restriction or allow the challenged restriction to remain in effect. But courts have broad equitable discretion, right? Where it's if under particular circumstances a restriction does pose an unconstitutional burden, and particularly if it's in the context of an election emergency where parties are seeking emergency relief, interim relief, courts do have broad equitable discretion to reshape the remedies that they impose in order to achieve the goals of both ensuring that all legally eligible voters have a reasonable opportunity to vote, while also ensuring the integrity of the electoral process. And even thinking back to laws that grant election officials discretion over how to respond to election emergencies, there are some steps that election officials can take that appropriately balance these considerations. For example, sending out absentee ballot request forms or absentee ballot applications to everyone on the voter registration list is one very proactive way that election officials can make it easier to vote absentee, can facilitate voting even in circumstances where it might be challenging, prepaying postage on absentee ballot return envelopes. Where these are steps that facilitate voting, reduce barriers to voting, while at the same time not jeopardizing the integrity of the process. Going further, for example, and actually mailing out actual absentee ballots to every single person on the voter registration records, particularly where we know, as a matter of empirical evidence, as many as 1 in 8 voter registration records are simply outdated. The voter has died, the voter has moved, the information was incorrect in the first place. In some circumstances, particularly where third-party voter registration groups are paid to file voter registration applications, they might even be fraudulent. Sending out absentee ballots, automatically without getting a request to every person in the voter registration database in the context of a presidential election, is setting the stage for unnecessary problems. You could at this scale, you would literally have millions of ballots going to outdated addresses, non-existent people, the wrong place, and so simply sending out the request forms gives you that check to ensure the voters can say, yes, I exist. Yes, I'm still registered to vote here. And here's the address where I want to send it to. So balancing both ends of the process, reducing the burdens while preserving the integrity of the process is essential for both policymakers in exercising their discretion, as well as courts in granting equitable relief. Thank you.
Rick, what do you think?
Thank you, Judge. And I want to start off by thanking the Federalist Society for this invitation. I always enjoy doing these panels because I appreciate discussions with more ideological kind of diversity and range of views than many of these discussions or conferences sometimes entail. And I'm going to try to pretend that I'm doing this in the standard large hotel ballroom that we usually do these panels in. And that you're laughing at any jokes I might make. So what I'd like to do, though, is I'd like to try to cover, at least over the course of the session, if not in my opening remarks, 3 main topics. The first is I want to give you a more concrete understanding about the significant hurdles that we are going to be facing to having a well-functioning election system this fall. And I want to talk about this a little bit more concretely than you may have heard before in some respects. The second thing I want to talk about, something Judge DeWine already alluded to, what the biggest risk is, in my view, of the kinds of situations or occurrences that could really destabilize the election result this fall and generate a kind of political turmoil we just don't want to be facing. And then the third thing is I wanted to discuss some policy recommendations I have for dealing with the kind of election we're going to have in the fall and trying to minimize the risk I'm worried about. First thing I want to do is clarify a terminological point that I think poisons some of these discussions and debates, and I think advocates and critics are all, or many, I should say, subject to this confusion. There's a big difference, as Michael just alluded to, between 2 different forms of what people sometimes call vote by mail. One is what's called no excuse absentee voting. The second is what many people think of when they hear the terms vote by mail. The difference between these two is exactly what Michael was just describing, which is in no excuse absentee voting, a voter has to request an absentee ballot, a registered voter. In true vote by mail, the state mails out ballots to everyone on the registration list. And I think advocates of no excuse absentee voting sometimes talk about vote by mail as if they're endorsing the second version when they're not. Critics, who I think are not necessarily critical of no excuse absentee voting, criticize vote by mail as if any form of voting by mail is their target. And I don't think that's actually true. So I think that does interfere with some of these discussions. Okay, so this fall, the fundamental fact is I think at least 80% of states, in my estimation, are going to move to no excuse absentee voting. In many of these states, particularly large ones, we're going to go from rates of absentee voting of, say, 5% to possibly 70%. In Wisconsin in April, when they had their primaries, there was a 650% increase in the number of absentee ballots cast. And in the fall, all states are going to be doing this simultaneously with the highest turnout election that we have. So let me just tick off some of the logistical and administrative difficulties this is going to pose. Just on the logistical side, voters have to request these ballots. Election officials have to take those requests, mail those ballots out. Voters have to fill them out, mail them back in. They have to be received by election officials. Normally, this is something like a 5 to 7 day process if the voter fills the ballot out right away and mails it back. The burden this is going to pose on local election officials and the U.S. Postal Service is something we have never faced. And we have already seen in much lower turnout elections that have been going on in these primaries, some of the difficulties arising already about getting ballots out, for example, to people who've requested them. In Wisconsin, thousands, maybe 12,000 or so voters who requested absentee ballots didn't get them. Can the Postal Service handle this burden? How much delay is this going to put into the process? Secondly, on the administrative side, most people don't realize absentee ballots are rejected at a rate of, in one recent study, 3%. Now, a 3% rejection rate of ballots when only 5% of them are absentee is one thing. But if you have 70% of the ballots cast absentee and a 3% rejection rate, that is one potential very troubling problem with the absentee process. Now, the rejection rate is that high because with absentee ballots, voters have to do various things to fill out the ballot envelope properly. They have to sign it. Some states require a witness to the signature. Some states even require a notary to witness the signature. And when those ballots come in, state officials have a much bigger task in processing them. They have to do signature verification. And on top of this, we want voters, in my view, to have an opportunity, as they do in many states already, to cure any defects in their absentee ballots. So in many states, you'll get a notice if the state says, we don't think your signature matches. Come in and prove that it does if you disagree. Or you fail to get a witness signature. Come in and sign in front of us. So voters need an opportunity to cure. And on top of this, voters who request an absentee ballot often show up at the polls in person. And so election officials have to be able to be sure someone who shows up in person who requested an absentee ballot didn't actually cast it. And that leads to greater use of what are called provisional ballots, which we're going to see, I think, increase significantly this fall. And all of this means that we are going to have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of ballots that, even if all this goes well, don't arrive until after election night, and certainly can't be counted until after election night. So that leads me to the big risk, in my view, or one of the big risks of destabilizing the outcome here, which is what Judge DeWine referred to earlier. And that is, picture a situation in which, 3 or 4 close states in a close election seem to be, or the leader in those states appears to be, not just on election night, but in the newspapers the next day, one candidate. And over the course of, let's say, 10 days or so, that lead erodes in several states, changing the outcome of the election. I think that circumstance in our current climate is going to be unbelievably explosive if it does occur. And that is one of my major concerns for the fall. Now, if I have a couple of minutes left, I'd like to offer a few policy recommendations to deal with all of this. They both try to deal with the massive surge of absentees we're going to get and the risk of this kind of destabilizing process. And I should say, we haven't talked about the problems yet of in-person voting this fall, which poses a whole other set of very difficult challenges for election officials. One thing I'm in favor of doing is requiring voters to request an absentee ballot a little earlier than they currently are required to in some states. So to take your state, Judge, of Ohio, until recently, Ohio allowed you to request an absentee ballot as late as noon the Saturday before the election. The earlier we can get people to request the ballots and to get the ballots back and to get them processed, the better, for many different reasons. And so I would be in favor of moving that date up to something like 5 days before the election. You need to request the ballot 5 days, no later than 5 days before the election. We can argue about exactly what the right number of days is. Many states actually have deadlines much earlier than that. A second thing I think is right now there are some major states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, in which the election officials are not allowed to start processing and getting these ballots ready to be counted until the polls closed on election night. And I think that's an enormous mistake in this context. Some states have started making changes in this process. Some already have permitted this. But I think election officials should be given the authority to start doing all the processing that's necessary, not the counting, but on election night when the polls close, those absentees that have come in are all ready to go when you push a button on the vote tabulating machine and they can be counted. Third thing I would change is I think states need to move back their deadlines for when they have to complete the canvass certification, the formal stages of the vote counting process. Because I don't know if states, Florida, for example, has a 14-day deadline that they have to finish this process. I don't know if states are going to be able to realistically do that, especially large states in these circumstances. And we don't want to be in a situation where they're running to court to try to get deadlines extended and the like. And finally, Congress, this will be my last point. What should Congress do here? Well, in my view, certainly what Congress ought to be doing is providing substantial additional funding to states and localities for running the election. So far, Congress has provided about $400 million, I believe. Estimates are that it may be around a $2 billion tab for states that are already, of course, in financial distress. But all of these logistical burdens are going to require tremendous investments of resources from states to get this process right. And the other thing Congress might consider doing, which I know it won't, it may provide funding. The statute that regulates the presidential vote counting process, called the Electoral Count Act, has a couple of key deadlines in it. And I think it would be wise to move those deadlines back a bit to allow more time for the states to complete this process in an appropriate way that protects the integrity of the election, protects the rights of voters. I don't have any illusions that Congress will do that. I hope we don't get into a situation where that becomes a problem. But let me stop there.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Brad, what do you want? Can you add to all this?
All right. Thank you, Judge, and thank you all for tuning in. So I was going to comment briefly on the federal role, although it is pretty brief, and to some extent, Rick has covered it, but people often ask, what can the feds do? And then I want to talk just a little bit more back into what the states ought to be doing in preparation. The federal law, of course, the Constitution allows Congress to set the time, place, and manner of holding elections. That clause has never been tested much, but presumably it is quite broad. It would allow, for example, I think a congressional act that would allow or require all mail voting or all kinds of things like that. As a practical matter, I think it's extremely, extremely unlikely, dumb and dumber unlikely that that's going to happen. And if it were to happen, then survive a possible presidential veto as well. So the main thing Congress can do, as Rick said, is provide funding to the states. And I'll come back to that in a moment. On the Electoral Count Act, note the deadline for states to act on that is December 8th. So if states have some kind of contest and they're not sure who has won their state, by December 8th, the legislature or judge or whatever the state provides needs to assign who those electors are in order to assure that they would be counted as they go forward. So that's sort of the drop dead date as it stands now for the states. And the date that Rick suggests could be moved back at least some small amount, giving states more time to put to get their information together. What happens if there is a challenge to electors at the presidential race? Of course, the House and Senate meet. Challenges can be raised. If a challenge is raised, the two houses meet separately. And if they, in the end, both decide a particular vote counts or both decide a particular vote doesn't count, then that carries the day. If the two chambers disagree, then under the federal statutes, they are required to use the certification of the state election official provided by state law. So that's going to be the sort of process by which that will work. But, we hear a lot of people asking bizarre questions, can Trump postpone the election or all kinds of things like that? And the basic answer to all of those things is no. We have a decentralized system, and these are, I often remind people, we don't really have federal elections. We have state elections for federal office, and these things are run under state laws, and that's who's going to make those decisions. Now, back to what the states can do themselves. Again, I would echo pretty much most of what Michael and Rick have said, Rick's policy suggestions. I would just offer a couple of key principles. One I would suggest is the old KISS, keep it simple, stupid. There's a lot of information that voters can get quite easily confused if there's changes going on, if there's a number of different ways to vote. People don't know, how do I vote? When do I vote? Do I have to use the postage stamps that the government sent me, or can I use some other system? There's all kinds of things that people get caught up in that. People begin to say, do I have to wait until I get the absentee ballot application from the state, or can I just go ask for one on my own? And it's remarkable, how much confusion there can be. So states, even as we try to make sure that people can vote, we need to be careful to try to keep the basic mechanism simple. And I think to the extent we can keep it in line with what people have largely experienced in the past, that will be a good thing. And for me, one of those things is it includes in-person voting, and in fact, attempting to encourage in-person voting. Now, one of the things that needs to be done on all of these is, and I think Rick emphasized this, is these decisions need to be made now, and they need to be attacked now, approached now. There need to be decisions made early. One thing that causes a lot of concern about the legitimacy of elections, Rick mentioned if we start having late swings in votes, as vote by mail comes in and so on. Another thing that I think has really undermined a lot of confidence in elections are late lawsuits. There's an old saw among election officials or election lawyers, what's the law of elections? It's whatever you can get some judge to agree to on election day morning, because there ain't going to be time for any appeal, right? And that, I think, really does tend to erode voter confidence when they see these late decisions by judges that sometimes they don't understand. I think that as a policy matter, judges should be very cognizant of what is sometimes called the Purcell principle for a 2006 case, Purcell v. Gonzalez, in which the Supreme Court warns, don't make late decisions that alter the election laws. And this actually goes back much further, even to the landmark Reynolds v. Sims case. So we don't want late decisions, and judges should be very skeptical, really invoke sort of a laches doctrine for any of these late lawsuits that could have been raised at an earlier date. And most of these issues should be known by now. In fact, there are already some 90 to 100 lawsuits around the country, and I think we want to be careful. We want those decisions made early and not a lot of late breaking decisions. And if people come in late and they could have raised these matters earlier, I think judges should be very skeptical. The other thing is that if we're going to do the in-person voting, and again, I believe that would be a good thing to maintain that, we need to be recruiting poll workers, especially. We need to be assuring people that the voting can be safe. And that's going to be a bigger job than usual in this election. One of the problems we've had in some of the state primaries is they've not been able to recruit poll workers, and they've ended up with very, very few polling places, and then you get long lines at those places, and then people are standing around in lines, and which is a bad thing anyway, but maybe especially bad if you've got the COVID virus going around. So we need to make a concerted effort there. We also need to recognize that for mail balloting as well, there's a lot of training needs to go on in advance, training for both the public and training for poll workers. You know, the states that use true, what Rick calls sort of true all-mail balloting, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, those states literally took several election cycles to kind of prepare their citizenry to vote in that manner. It's not as easy as people think. And so we need to begin training folks now, training the public, and also educating the poll workers. For example, most poll workers have very little experience in signature match. You know, they tend to rely on the state ID laws and so on to see that the person is who it is. When you're doing mail balloting or no excuse absentee voting, you're going to have a lot of need to do proper signature match, not have too many things rejected, but at the same time, not just accept anything that comes in through the pipe. So a lot of advanced preparation needs to be done, and legislators need to be doing it now. And it really is more state legislatures. Most of the election officials know these things, but sometimes they're waiting on the legislature to tell us, are we going to have no fall absentee voting? Are we going to have all mail voting? You know, tell us what we're going to do and what kind of budget you're going to give me. So we need the Congress to act now if they're going to subsidize this, and we need the states to act now in determining what we're going to do come fall. Thank you.
All right, Rachel.
Well, thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I guess I'm cleanup batter, so I will try to move quick. I want to talk about why change is needed in this election, a little bit of history, how to prep for disruptions, and 4 actions that are needed, which are going to sound a lot like Rick's actions. I think we agree on 3 of the 4, and we might have an interesting discussion about the 4th. So first, why do we need to consider change in November? There's 3 reasons. First, our elections are supposed to represent voters, and the voters are telling us they're pretty darn worried about coronavirus in November. So Ohio, the judge's state, ran a poll. It was a small poll, but more than 500 voters said that 50% were unlikely to vote in person if the coronavirus was still a reality at that point. 27% definitely wouldn't. 79% wanted every voter to have a prepaid postage envelope with their ballot. Those numbers you don't usually see numbers like that. People don't have strong opinions about how they vote, about that process like that. So there's a very strong feeling, and this is Republican and Democratic. 67% of Republicans wanted to get a ballot mailed to them in Ohio. You see those numbers repeated. The people who are actually happiest with their voting structures right now are those in vote by mail states, but you're seeing a lot of voter demand for change. Second is not causing unnecessary confusion. We were just hearing about Purcell. There's a very strong preference in the law that judges shouldn't change election rules close to election day, and that makes a lot of common sense. In this kind of a situation where you might have unexpected glitches, there's a strong likelihood that if we don't act now, there will be a need for change close to election day, and it's confusing, as Brad Smith was just saying. And the third that hasn't come up, I do international and comparative work. Our international standing is really on the line, our legitimacy as a functional democracy. When you look at Georgia and Wisconsin and how those are being weaponized against us. Just to give you a sense of it, South Korea voted in April. It was very smooth. You didn't hear about it in the news because there really wasn't much to report. It's a highly polarized society, not that unlike ours, very, very split, and yet very smooth voting. India's voting, if you think South Korea is too small, India has 900 million voters. Their votes take place in waves over about 5 weeks. It's entirely electronic. Despite massive illiteracy, they report out the last day of that voting. It's very smooth. I've talked to the head of their election system about how they do it. It's kind of a miracle. America is looking a lot more like Indonesia, and this is not good. Indonesia is an archipelago of 18,000 islands. It's the fourth biggest country in the world, so it's similar in size to us. Their last election last year, 550 poll workers died because they were forced to work more than 24 hours in a row to try to clean up the election at the end and count things very quickly. And they're old, like our poll workers are older. We don't want 550 election workers dying in China to use that against us. So I think it's hard to state when you look internationally just how far behind America is and how much our own systems have been keeping us from updating the way that we vote so that we can, frankly, just represent internationally what democracy can do. Now, the history of change has been very incremental in the United States, and I would say that's good. We didn't have a secret ballot until the 1890s, 120 years after the founding. Direct election for senators took a couple more years. We didn't have a criminal conviction for paying someone to vote until the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1925. Until then, it was perfectly legal according to criminal law. And that actually didn't apply to primary elections until 1971, the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971. There were still civil laws against it, but these have been changes over time. The biggest changes to our system have, of course, been about rights to vote. About a third of our amendments to our Constitution have been on rights to vote, the 15th, the 19th, the 23rd, 24th, 26th. And so we've made changes, and war often brings about changes. World War II, you got changes. For instance, Navajo code talkers who helped us win World War II were disenfranchised during World War II. They only got the vote in states like mine in New Mexico in 1948. It was only universal in 1957. Primaries were an innovation. So there's been lots of changes over time. And making a change one time during a pandemic is just not that big a deal, really, when you come down to it. It's an incremental change. It's a single time change. But getting ahead of the problem is really important. So let me talk about why that is. The likelihood of disruption has been, Rick shared all the problems with the likelihood of disruption of absentee. It's also very strong for in-person. We use a lot of nursing homes for our in-person voting. We use a lot of schools for our in-person voting. Nursing homes are clearly out. Schools are likely out. We have teams of two that do things like tending to machines, opening ballots. Those teams of two work together to ensure that there's not fraud at the moment of an election change. How are teams of two going to function in a socially distanced era? 6 feet apart is pretty broad for actually paying attention to what your team is doing. I was just on a call, I think Michael was on the same call, where the election folks are really thinking about, do we sanitize pens or not? I don't know if you were there over the lunchtime talk, Michael, but they're trying to figure out the real logistics. How many pens do they order if people take the pens home? Do they ask people to bring pens from home? So the level of logistics here is really significant. And I'm glad that people are planning, but it's kind of hard to overstate what November is going to look like and why it's going to look so different. Given that background is why I support growing the absentee ballot right now. And to make this clear, 25% or about 25%, it depends, of our voters already vote absentee at the presidential level. So again, it's an incremental change, somewhere between 23 and 26%, depending on which poll you look at, are voting absentee already. And about half the states allow no excuse absentee voting. What we're seeing in places like Wisconsin, places like Alaska, where I'm from, is that people are making use of that, whether folks at the political level change things or not. So even if the politicians make no decisions, in about half the states, New Mexico is also one of them, voters are making their own decisions, and they're asking for these absentee ballots. But with a lack of preparation happening at the political level, the system is getting overwhelmed. That's what happened in Wisconsin with 1 million extra ballots requested. That's what's happening in a lot of places where people ask for absentee ballots. They don't show up, and then they go to the polls, and they're overwhelming the polls. So expanding this system simply makes sense. It's one of the oldest changes to our voting system, actually. We started absentee ballots during the Civil War to help troops vote. And it's still the main way that troops overseas vote. So it's very common if you serve in the military. It's been used for 20 years by Oregon. 5 states do it for everything. And with respect to Brad, I moved to Colorado. Now I live in New Mexico, but I moved to Colorado about a decade ago and didn't get any training in how to use this system. I'd moved from a system where you have to go in person. But as a young mother, I was certainly glad. There's nothing like being a young mother with a baby on your hip, trying to fill in a very small circle without the baby kicking you and making you vote for the wrong person, to make you appreciate being able to vote from home during nap time. For the kid, not necessarily for you. So there's a lot of ways and a lot of people who that system can help. So let me just get to what should we do about these kinds of changes. So first, I think we need to, as Rick was saying, broaden no excuse absentee balloting, but we also need to move it earlier. One of the realities of having a fraud-proof election, there's been a lot of talk about fraud in this election. I actually think that an awful lot of it is a fair concern. Nobody wants a fraudulent election, but misplaced. The biggest form of fraud is computer hacking. That's the only kind of fraud that can happen at scale, is computer hacking. And so the more that we have computers that don't have paper ballots to double check, the more likely fraud is from foreign as well as domestic actors. Absentee ballots actually give you a paper ballot, so they're a very good check on that kind of fraud. The smaller kinds of possible fraud, individuals filling out the wrong ballots, first of all, don't happen at scale. They could affect local elections, highly unlikely to affect national elections. They're very, very rare. If you look at the Heritage Foundation's list of all the fraud over the last 20 years or so that they could find, it's actually not very common at all. And some of the systemic issues have been dealt with in states that regularly vote by mail, and that's things like electronic signature tracking and putting barcodes on each envelope. Actually, Utah, one of the states that regularly votes by mail, had a systemic problem. They had parents filling out the ballots for their kids when their kids went on mission, and they had to put a stop to overly active parents, which they did because they caught the signatures. But to catch the signatures, you need to be able to print the barcode so that everyone only gets one ballot, and you need signature matching, which requires training or requires machines. So the reason to broaden no excuse absentee, but move it earlier, is because you need to either purchase the machines or you need to do the training, and you need to be able to get the vendors to print the ballots with the barcode that's individualized to the individual voter. So it's really quite important. Second, as Rick was saying, start counting early. There's a number of states that have laws that actually prevent early counts of absentee ballots. Those laws can be changed in most cases. In some cases, Connecticut has a very hard law. There's a handful of states where it's actually quite difficult. But particularly in the states where we know there's going to be a lot of attention on the legitimacy of the election, your Wisconsins, your Michigans, and Pennsylvanias, the more that we can do to simplify, as Brad was saying, ahead of time, the better. So start counting early wherever we can. Provide more money for elections to states, but also to the post office. Our post office is required by law to do various things like get mail to Fairbanks, Alaska, where it does not make sense to get mail, frankly, most of the time. That's where I'm from, and I can tell you it takes a long time to get mail there. They have to get mail to rural New Mexico as well, and they have to do it for the same price everywhere. Those kinds of laws are one reason. Also, the fact that they have to fund their personnel. They have to pay for the entirety of their personnel for 50 to 75 years. Their healthcare and retirement upfront, which is one of the reasons their numbers look so bad. It's a budgeting problem. Anyhow, because of these problems, the post office is in fact running a huge deficit. And if we're going to expand absentee voting, or if we're not going to expand it, but the voters are going to force it to expand, we need to deal with that. So more money for elections to states, more support for our post office. The fourth, that I don't know if Rick will agree with me on, is I think we need to tell people ahead of time that the votes won't come out that day. This is not unprecedented. Plenty of countries don't report their vote that day. In fact, when we do report that vote that day, you actually disenfranchise certain states, de facto, not de jure. But you often, when you're voting in Alaska or you're voting in Hawaii, you actually can get the national vote before you're done voting. It's extremely demoralizing. But your polls are still open while you're seeing that the national vote's been finalized. There's just no reason for that. We can prep our people, our citizenry, to say, you're going to hear the vote later on. And I think that would give everyone time to deal with the cures, to deal with the many likely difficulties that we're going to face. And if people got more used to that, it would also take down the temperature. We're facing an election in November where the temperature is likely to be quite high. And again, looking from an international perspective, we just don't need protests, riots, armed folks coming out about anger over an election when we're trying to compete with China on the international stage. We really need to take down the temperature, and reporting out a couple days later and letting people know that's what's going to happen so that there's a more legitimate count by the time we get one is one way to do it. So I'll stop there.
Great. Let's take some questions from the audience. I'd remind people that if you want to ask a question, to hit the raise your hand button on your computer. Don't raise your hand. Hit the raise your hand button. And if you're on a phone, press *9. We have a question from a question from James Bopp. Go ahead, James.
Unmute now. Thank you. I want to comment on Michael's explanation of what is going on with respect to the lawsuits that the Democrat and their allies have brought to try to force and require mail-in balloting or no excuse balloting, and then strip away remaining fraud protections. I really think the pedigree of this did not arise in the context of the COVID virus, even though they were exploiting it. But it really began 2 years ago when the Democrats launched a similar effort to through litigation and other efforts to do exactly this same thing. They planned for the last 2 years on how to do it again in this election cycle, and then the COVID problem arose, and they have ruthlessly exploited it. I think this is a really dedicated effort to strip away required fraud protections that
James,
will increase substantially.
Is there a question here, James, that you have?
So my question is, Michael, what do you are you familiar with the history of these kind of cases being brought 2 years ago, and the organizations that the Democrats have established to carry out this plan over the last several years?
Michael, there you go.
So yeah, I mean, here in Florida, for example, during the 2018 election cycle, both in the gubernatorial race and the U.S. Senate race, both were very close. At one point, there were a dozen simultaneous lawsuits challenging various aspects of the electoral process, arguing that certain ballots that were invalid under state law or otherwise that state law said can't be counted, nevertheless should be counted. And so, yes, you're seeing similar relief being sought in the lawsuits brought now as a result of COVID. You're seeing many of the same legal provisions being challenged as a result of COVID. The main difference, of course, is the theory of the cases, right? Many of the cases being brought in the COVID era are as applied challenges, pointing specifically to the unique burdens and risks that, to greater or lesser extent, depending on particularly what time you're talking about, the virus poses. And I mean, to take perhaps one of the easiest examples, something as simple as signatures to get on the ballot, right? The U.S. Supreme Court has generally upheld the constitutionality of reasonable signature requirements, saying that depending on the office, you might have to get 500 signatures, 1,000 signatures. In an era where the governor has issued a stay-at-home order, in an era where you can't be congregating in public, right? You certainly can't be going up to strangers in public. There's a threat of transmission even from handing somebody something. What would ordinarily be a constitutionally unremarkable and innocuous signature requirement could very well pose unique burdens and threats and risks in COVID, could result in candidates who ordinarily would be on the ballot being wholly excluded. And so in those types of situations, some courts have been willing to relax signature requirements, have been willing to allow alternate forms of signatures. And the main thing, I think, isn't to say that none of that, we have to run the elections exactly the same as if there weren't a global pandemic, right? Circumstances on the ground are often going to preclude that. The real issue is in modifying election laws and modifying the rules governing the electoral process to remove measures that under the circumstances of a pandemic become unconstitutional burdens, like these signature requirements for petitions. How do we do so in a way that ensures the integrity of the process, right? If the state election code counts on a particular measure, such as, let's say, a signature match requirement for absentee ballots, if you just tear down that measure without having the court imposing some sort of replacement, some sort of alternative, then yes, you've expanded access to the vote, but at the same time, you've unnecessarily undermined the integrity of the process. So in situations where a court is persuaded that under the unique circumstances of COVID, even a law that otherwise would be constitutionally valid, that otherwise could remain in effect, where there's a need to enjoin or modify those statutes, it's important to focus on the remedial stage as well. They need to do so in a way through an order that adopts alternate mechanisms that are tailored to COVID in order to promote both state interests, expanding the vote as well as ensuring the integrity of the process.
Great. Thanks. What question I have thinking about, is there a possibility that we get to September, October, and all of a sudden there's a second wave, and I don't know what the election day is, but the day before the election, one state says we're going to postpone our election for a week? Is that doable? Is that something that could happen? And if so, will the Supreme Court intervene?
Well,
no prediction.
I can take that at least initially. Of course, Congress has set the date for the election here. I believe it's November 9th of this year under their time, place, and manner clause. And one of the problems that you have is that, a lot of these primaries, there were late changes, but you can more easily do a do-over, so to speak, in a primary. And that's going to be tough to do when you've got a date that is set by Congress. So I do think one of the many things that legislatures should be trying to clarify now is who, if anybody, can in fact call off an election. One of the, in Ohio, for example, the director of public health ordered the polls closed as a public health measure less than 12 hours before people were due to start voting in the primaries. It worked out again because the legislature then acted fairly quickly to set a new date for the election. That's going to be much tougher to do in the fall. So that needs to be addressed. And I think that officials need to be aware of the fact that they may need to act on a more rapid basis. I'm loath to be critical of officials in Ohio or elsewhere. You're trying to cope with new situations you've never seen before. But in Ohio, they kept putting off that decision and putting it off and putting it off. And you got to make it at least far enough in advance that there can be some type of last minute adjustment for people to add absentee votes or to take other actions at that particular point in time.
Okay. Just remind anyone who wants to ask a question, hit the raise your hand button. One of the things that I think's interesting in this context is we're talking about undue burdens. We're talking the litigation. To what extent should these really be legislative decisions? I mean, the courts. You really have a situation where you're dealing with competing interests, whether it's ballot requirements, public health, whether or not to make changes to those requirements. Is that something that courts really ought to be involved in, or should there be more of a legislative role in these things? Should legislatures be poised to move more quickly, and should courts defer to the legislative branch here? If they don't move more quickly, should we defer to them anyway?
If I can respond to that, I would say two things about that. First, there's a significant difference, which is subtle and not often appreciated, between courts saying a current rule or policy is unconstitutional. It's an undue burden on the right to vote, as Michael was describing, in the context of this pandemic, even if it would otherwise be constitutional, and leaving it to the legislature to then update the policy, versus courts saying this policy is unconstitutional and here's what you are required to do. And in the litigation that's gone on so far, we've seen courts, some courts doing one, some courts doing the other. We now, for the first time, have a couple of courts of appeals decisions on some of these issues. And the Fifth Circuit and the Sixth Circuit, I think, have been trying to draw this line between the court's power to hold something unconstitutional and then the question of where the remedy in the first instance comes from. Now, the second point I would make about this, which goes to something Brad said earlier, this is a puzzle for courts, because for all the reasons Brad's talked about, we want courts, if they're going to be making decisions about these things, to make them early, not last minute. But if they're making them early, they may be asked to be jumping in before the legislature has had a chance to engage with some of these issues. Now, in these primaries, it was a different context where the primary was imminent. The pandemic kind of broke. There was very little time. And it was hard to imagine a kind of back and forth between courts and legislatures. There had to be decisions made, and courts made them. But for the fall election, I think this is a real puzzle. Should judges defer waiting for some period of time for a legislative response, thereby kind of pushing off the date of reckoning? Or should they, kind of make the decision at the moment the litigation is presented? And we don't have a good answer to that, but I think it's a real puzzle for courts that we're just beginning to kind of recognize.
Great, thanks, Rick. I think Gene may have a question, and then we have after that we'll take Gary Lawson.
Yeah, I'm curious about one specific problem, which is the question of, it's sometimes been termed vote harvesting, how much of a problem that is or is not, that exists quite aside from the current issues with COVID, that certainly classically nursing homes, but certain other areas there can be when you have when absentee ballots essentially get much more widespread and much wider use. It seems to me there's an increased danger of that. And I just wonder if anybody has ideas of protections in terms of that, claim it's not a real problem or it is a real problem. I'm just interested in the panel's thoughts.
I'm happy to take that one. So vote harvesting is a scary word for something that's actually happened a long time. And what it means is that someone goes around collecting people's votes and bringing them in. As you said, it's happened in nursing homes for a long time because those folks can't move. And so they need someone to go there, which is why we have so many voting places in nursing homes, because we often bring the vote to them. Sometimes it's nefarious. So sometimes there's an attempt to influence the vote or an attempt to change the vote. We saw that in Georgia, for instance, by a political operative. That's happened on both sides of the aisle. It's been quite rare, but it's been fairly steady over time. It happens once in a while, mostly in local elections. It's too small to really change the elections at a federal level, but we have seen it affect judicial elections, for instance, and other local elections. So you can sort of see the steady beat of you catch 20 votes here at this nursing home and 20 here. It's not only at nursing homes. Some states allow it for other places where it's hard to vote. For one reason or another, there's not good postal service or what have you, and you're allowed to collect. So I think of, say, Alaska Native villages where you're hundreds of miles from any situation where your votes can go somewhere. And so someone has to take all the votes by airplane and move them. If you can't vote by mail, that person is a vote harvester. So linguistically, that's what vote harvesting is. And sometimes nefarious, sometimes not. Many states now have laws against it. It's at the state level. And the states that have laws against it often have quite significant punishments for it. The same way when you sign an absentee ballot, you usually have to sign on the back of the envelope that you accept a huge fine and a number of years in jail if you're engaging in fraudulent behavior. So you have to do that sort of thing for vote harvesting. Where it's been banned or where there's larger vote by mail operations, it actually tends to happen less. It's more prevalent in places where it either hasn't been fully banned or where they don't have vote by mail because you need it in places. And so it's harder to ban it altogether. However, there are many easy remedies for it. For instance, you could have not one ballot harvester, but two from either party that have to go to a nursing home together. If they had to perform all of their duties together from each party and had to carry the votes back together, you see that sort of thing in elections in, say, Bangladesh, where people from both parties have to do everything for these particular groups of people. You can imagine right now that there are groups of people who have the coronavirus who can't go in to vote because they'd be dangerous to the election poll workers, but they deserve the vote. They have a citizen's right to vote. How do we collect their votes? That's ballot harvesting. However, we collect their votes if it's not them turning it in and it's not by mail. But the remedy is fairly simple. You could also have totally nonpartisan groups going and doing this, the League of Women Voters. The problem with things like that is that many of our nonpartisan groups highly involved in our in our elections are older. The poll workers tend to be over 60. In Alaska, the average age is 72, I heard from a election leader there. So these older, mostly women who are trying to do this job, you don't want to endanger them. And so that's the only issue with nonpartisan altogether. But bipartisan seems to me a fairly good, or cross-partisan if you have a strong libertarian party or what have you, seems to me a fairly good balance.
Anyone else want to jump in on this topic?
Sure. Can I do just a partial dissent from Rachel? I first agree with something Rachel said in her opening comments, that I don't think what we might call voter fraud, that is people pretending to be someone they're not or voting when they're not eligible to vote, is a widespread problem. And the greater danger is what I might call election fraud or counting fraud, where you have, where you can, if you can hack machines or something like that and change large vote totals. Having said that, we do have a lot of close elections, and we have a lot of close elections for Congress as well. And during the long debate over voter ID laws, the common refrain of those critical of voter ID laws was, oh, there's so little impersonation here. And, you don't require ID on absentee ballots, which was often the case. And then they'd add, and that's where the fraud is. And actually, I agree with that. The fraud, such as it is more likely to occur in mail-in voting and in absentee voting. And some of it is also not fraud in the sense that it's necessarily obviously illegal, but there can be quite a bit of intimidation and pressure put on people, particularly sometimes older people or people in weaker mental states and so on, by people who are harvesting votes. And Rachel has suggested that the solution is relatively simple, and she suggested some ways that it could be done. I think there should be contrasted with what are really bad ballot harvesting processes. For example, states that allow essentially anybody to go and gather as many ballots as they want, states that allow paid workers for partisan campaigns to go and harvest ballots, states that even allow them to be paid based on the number of ballots they can show that they brought in. And so I do think that there are some very negative things that go on with ballot harvesting, and that states, if they're not going to ban it completely, definitely need to take some serious precautionary measures, that it is it's not a good thing. And then when we talk about the voter ID laws, we get very concerned. If any one person can't vote, it's often the argument, well, the same applies here. If any one person is intimidated or has their vote changed or stolen, if we're going to use that kind of absolute standard, then that's the kind of standard we should use. And I don't want to downplay it too much. So that's sort of a dissent, perhaps not so much from the substance, but perhaps a little bit from the nuance or adding a touch to Rachel's comments.
Yeah. I remember when I first got involved in politics in Ohio, there was a very nice little old lady in a very small county who knitted sweaters for a lot of elderly people in the county, and she happened to pick up their absentee ballots when she did. She actually ended up doing a little bit of time in state prison for that. But I know, at least anecdotally, it does go on even in Ohio. Gary Lawson, you're up. Gary, you there? You look like you're on mute, Gary.
I think I'm now open. All right. Now, this is, in some sense, a fortuitous question because it follows right on the prior discussion. First, let me say this has been a tremendous panel, not surprisingly at all, given who's on it. And the thing that it raised that I hadn't really focused on, but also comes out of the ballot harvesting issue, is the importance of teams in the counting process. Whatever data we have on vote fraud comes from a context in which ordinarily you would have a certain set of checks in place on that. If the whole point is that people have to be 6 feet apart, how is that going to affect the ability to send out teams for harvesting? And in the more mundane context, where you've got human beings doing opening of envelopes, tabulating of envelopes, counting of votes, if people have to be that far apart, that particular aspect of the checking process is gone. Does anyone have a suggestion for how one can maintain that multiple person check on the tabulation and counting process if the whole premise of the next election is that people have to be socially distancing? It's a huge problem. I'd love to hear what the concrete recommendations are for that.
Who wants to give a recommendation?
I'll jump into the breacher. Rick, is that you?
You go ahead. I have some thoughts too. Oh, well, I certainly haven't thought about this question before, and I want to mull it over some. One of the reactions I have to the question goes back to something that Brad talked about, which is it still remains very important that we have in-person voting. And I actually think that people be encouraged to vote in person, at least if it's going to be able to be made reasonably safe. And I think people may well be much more comfortable doing that in November than they might be today, because I assume we are going to get experienced and with social distancing, with wearing masks in various settings, and it will be normalized in some sense, which may make people more comfortable going to the polls. The reasons for that are partly related to what Gary asked about, which is there's a significant percentage of voters who do not trust mail-in voting for themselves, for their own ballots. They are worried about this counting process and what happens, and they don't see the ballot, they don't see the machine where they're actually touching the screen and casting a vote. And so for voter confidence, continued in-person voting, I think, remains important, and also I don't think raises the issue that Gary is talking about in too acute a form, because basically it's the machines that are doing the tabulating. Now, when you talk about absentee ballots, this becomes a bigger issue, because in some states, the absentee ballots are counted by hand. The signature verification process requires people. And one of the problems with ramping up from 5% of the ballots being absentee to 70% is states need to purchase equipment that can tabulate these massive number of votes absentee, instead of trying to count them all by hand, as these states typically do. I don't know how big the problem is that Gary raises, which is a novel one for me in the first time. In South Korea, as Rachel mentioned, they had the largest turnout they've ever had for a parliamentary election at the height of the pandemic. You can see the photos of the poll workers and the protective equipment being socially distant. I honestly don't know how serious a problem this would be, but there are things we can do to minimize it, in part by encouraging in-person voting for people who feel comfortable doing it.
Rachel, did you want to?
I don't disagree with Rick ever, but certainly not in this case.
You can be on a panel with me anytime then.
How about William Marshall? We have a question.
Hi, let me echo Gary's comments that this was really an excellent panel. The question I have, and it's really how to deal with the rhetoric, is that no matter what happens, we are so polarized that whoever loses this election is going to claim the election is illegitimate. And there are going to be enough flaws in the system one way or another that there's going to be a colorable case to do that. How do we protect against or do something in advance to protect against the rhetoric that will follow afterwards and the danger that rhetoric may cause to the legitimacy of whatever election takes place?
Excellent question. You want to take this one, Michael? Or?
I'm just imagining what Twitter will look like, right? The day after election day, and right, how do you fix that? Right? I mean, they're on both sides, right? I mean, there's some groups of people who were just going to say what they're going to say, and that's fine. I mean, I just think of myself, right? I mean, as an academic, as someone who specializes in election law, right? As someone who participates on panels like this, talks to the media. I mean, my main safeguard against that is simply just trying to be responsible in what I say, trying to ensure that when I do say something, when I do assert a conclusion, that it's something that it's not hyperbole, it's not just something I saw on Twitter, that it's actually based on facts and evidence. And the more experts, the more thought leaders, the more people in a position to say what is actually going on, credible sources to which people can turn to, hopefully, to the extent that they can at least identify the universe. Certain claims are just absolutely out of bounds, right? Certain claims just aren't even in play. Maybe other claims, there's a little bit of gray area, there's a little bit of wiggle room. We either need to know what the facts are, we need to have a court explicate what the law is. Basically, the more that we can just take responsibility ourselves in how we articulate our concerns, how we explain to the public what's going on, hopefully, at least to some extent, we can, just based on that credibility, we can persuade people, the sorts of things that are not a crisis, that are not actually something to be concerned about, that are perfectly fine, as opposed to those where there is room for concern, there is room for debate, and hopefully have those disputes channeled toward the correct mechanisms, whether that be a court, whether that be election officials in a recount or some process like that, or potentially in the extreme case, the chambers of Congress themselves.
Can I respond to that? Because go ahead, Rachel, you can go ahead.
Oh, it looks like we all want to jump in on this one. It is my biggest worry, to be honest. My research area is democracies having problems. And I hadn't worked on the United States for the first number of years in my think tank. And in about 2014, we saw America following enough of the patterns that we saw overseas that my whole program at Carnegie started to look at America as well as other democracies, because it was just not conscionable not to. Based on my election monitoring overseas, people would already be having questions about legitimacy in this election. When you monitor an election overseas, you start about a year ahead of time and you look at all the things that are going on. And we would be looking at the primary processes and the problems happening in some of these primaries. It's worth knowing that an awful lot of elections are decided in the primaries. Here in New Mexico, about 40% of seats are decided in the primaries for state office as well as federal. You can get different counts depending on how safe you think seats are, but that's not uncommon. We have more and more states where the real issue is your primary challenger, not your general election. So the problems in the primaries are already causing trouble. That said, as Michael was saying, making sure that this election in November feels as legitimate as is humanely possible, I think, is incredibly important to our country, to our people, to the state of our democracy. And so that has to do with things like experts making bipartisan or cross-partisan groups that can state that we think it's legitimate. Hopefully that will be the case. I think it has to do with getting ahead of some of these problems so that November doesn't look like Georgia or Wisconsin, but looks much more normal. I think there's quite a lot we can do by getting ahead of the problems, which is why I'm spending so much time on panels like this, trying to get folks to be thinking about the problems and planning ahead. Americans used to be renowned for our ingenuity, and I think applying that now would be very good. We don't have to be as stuck as we are in old ways of doing things. And by that, I mean things like, we know right now that our poll workers are a very elderly force. We know right now that a lot of them are likely to drop out on the day of if they're at all afraid. And we know right now that elections do end up with problems. I was in New York during Hurricane Sandy. That was right before a general election. We do have states that face disasters right before elections and have to deal with them. So we know all that right now. Scenario planning for that, making sure that there are plans in place. Right now you could be recruiting younger poll workers. Many of them are out of work because of the COVID crisis. We need a younger poll force anyway. You can't have poll workers who are all in their 60s and 70s for all that long. So starting to prep now and starting to take seriously that this is not just a partisan issue, but this is really an issue of how our democracy functions over the long term, and coming together across parties, kumbaya-ish as that sounds, just to deal with some of these logistical hurdles so that on the day of we can stand up as a cross-partisan group and say, we do think this was a legitimate election, or as legitimate as we can do. But as the caller said, it's something I'm already worried about, because internationally we would already be saying that the problems in the primaries are quite problematic.
Rick, what do you think?
Well, I think Bill Marshall asked the question that's on lots of our minds. Anyone who is realistic about our current political climate realizes that both sides view the election as kind of existential. It's not an ordinary election. Everything's at stake. The country will never be the same. And with social media priming the pump, and with the number of media outlets that are now out there with this fragmented media culture, views will get amplified very quickly from one side or the other. I want to answer in part by coming back to the fourth point Rachel raised initially, which she said I might disagree with. I'm going to agree with it with a big but after. So absolutely, we need to be educating voters, and the media is starting to do this, that we may not have a result until a week after the election. Some of us have been talking about election week, not election night. The but is, I don't think that will be nearly sufficient in our climate. I don't think if we end up in a situation with a lot of votes shifting a week after the election, where it could affect the outcome, no matter how much the media is preaching that, as I've joked, it's a little bit like preaching abstinence. In our climate, it's going to be equally as effective. And so in response to Bill, this is why part of my approach is to try to forestall the problem by getting as many of the ballots in before Election Day, getting them counted by Election Day. The second thing, and I want to get reactions from other people on this, as Rachel said, a number of us have been talking about trying to form groups of either bipartisan former election administrators or academics who are considered sort of as honest a set of brokers as you can get about some of these issues, and in real time trying to issue judgments about disputed sort of legal issues that might arise, or administrative issues. Now, can that be persuasive to people in our culture? Does anybody believe enough in sort of independent expertise? I don't know. There's lots of reasons to doubt that, but I would be interested in hearing reactions to that, because that is one of the things we've been talking about in various election task forces, to try to create some space for credible input on what may be disputed legal issues that will explode.
What do you think? Does that make sense? Brad, you have a reaction to that?
I'll respond first with my pre-legal training in economics. Let's assume we have a landslide, and then all the questions of legitimacy go away. So that's how an economist would handle this. But assuming we don't have a landslide, I've heard many people suggest what Rick has suggested. I agree with Michael. We all need to be responsible. Our press needs to be more responsible, our candidates and everybody. I'm a little skeptical of the idea that you can have a group that does this for a couple of reasons. One is some of the issues are going to be tough. They're going to be not obvious, claims. And as soon as you get that, certain people are going to be more reluctant to judge immediately. We want briefing and so on, right? We want to make sure we know the facts. And the other thing is that if you announce these groups and they're set up in advance and here's who they are, what happens when there's a disagreement within the group? And at least on some of these issues, there could be. And that, if anything, might boomerang and further, infuse the idea that it's all been rigged. So, and I also am skeptical that the public is in the mood to accept, a bunch of us academics saying, here's the right result. So my own sense, although I won't say there's nothing to that idea, I find it an intriguing one. I think probably we're better off to just comment in our individual capacities, and as Michael says, attempt to do so in a way that's responsible and informed and deliberative.
Any other thoughts on Rick's proposal?
So I'm part of some of these groups too, mostly because it's all I can do given my actual place I sit, rather than because I think they'll be so effective. I actually think that there is a real problem with you have a public that's in a populist mood on both the left and the right, and elites are not big players when the public is in a populist mood. But I do wonder about what we used to call, when I worked more politically, the hacks. If you have the hacks and the wonks, I fall on the wonk side in terms of policy thinking. But the folks who are really involved in campaigns, who have a huge incentive to be partisan, if enough of probably the formers, not the currents are both extremely busy and have a very strong stake in the outcome. But if you could get people who are seen as being quite partisan to come together and say that things were legitimate, that might have some more credibility among both partisan sides. So here I'm thinking of, some of Bernie Sanders' campaign folks, people like Matthew Dowd, who did George W.'s campaign, and so on and so forth. The people who really have been in the trenches. And I wonder if organizing them would provide a little bit more credibility than organizing some of us.
Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
I was just going to quickly add on that. I mean, this also loops back to the discussion that we were having earlier, whether it's in terms of election officials figuring out what types of modifications to make to the process, whether it's in terms of courts figuring out what types of judicial relief to award in the types of litigation we've been discussing concerning the electoral process. Protecting the perceived integrity of the process is in many ways just as important as protecting the underlying right to vote, right? In campaign finance law, the Supreme Court has this famous recurring holding where the government has a compelling interest in preventing corruption and an independent interest in preventing the appearance of corruption, because it's important that not just that the system actually be fair, but that the system appear to be fair. And I think with regard to the electoral process, especially given what everybody is talking about, we know how primed the public is. We know, there's been academic research on hyper-polarization, hyper-partisanship in recent days. I think both election officials and courts need to be extremely sensitive about imposing measures that would introduce additional uncertainty into the process about the integrity, about the unfairness. So I mean, like with the third-party ballot harvesting issue we were talking about before, right? If you allow the voter to return the ballot, if you allow immediate family members to return the ballot, you allow the postal service to return the ballot, perhaps you provide the postage on the ballot, you have drop centers. Taking the next step and saying, oh, and by the way, any random person who might not even be known to the voter or to election officials can also take the ballots, as many as they want, and bring them back. that seems to be kind of the bridge too far that unnecessarily creates these problems, that unnecessarily contributes to these types of objections to the integrity of the process. Then when later on, based on the outcome of the election, those are things then that people can point to and say, oh, it was the third party ballot harvesters designing the system, designing the rules in a way where you're trying to promote voting rights and also the appearance of a fair process, right? That public perception of legitimacy. I think both are crucially important points.
Can I make a comment that goes to Judge DeWine, actually, which is, I think in this context, this is sort of obvious, but it's extremely important that judges on multi-member appellate courts and Supreme Courts struggle incredibly hard to issue decisions that are going to be unanimous. That is one institution that has come under, it has felt the pressures of polarization, and the courts are not looked at to as large an extent as they were by a broad swath of the public as, relatively independent appliers of the law. That's definitely come under, that's eroded. But it's far worse when courts are divided on these issues. And that's one place we can get some stabilization and some perhaps consensus if we can get unanimous decisions out of courts. And that means judges perhaps suppressing some disagreements they might have. It means giving ground. I think that's actually an extremely important aspect to all of this, because we know the courts are going to be brought into this, state courts and federal courts. And I would not underestimate the importance of courts being able to generate unanimity.
As a justice, I'm all for unanimity. The challenge is that my colleagues don't always see things the way I do. So I have to. I think that's a good point. This is really we could do a whole another hour and a half really on that issue, at least as a judge, when it makes sense to dissent, when what the value of having unanimous opinions are, what the dangers are those for future cases, sacrificing what you think is a relevant legal principle. I mean, those are hard questions, but I certainly understand your point. I think we have about 2 minutes left. Anyone want to offer one final anything anyone's dying to say before we sign off here? Well, I see Gene coming on as well. I don't see anyone. Brad, if you want to say something.
I'll offer a real quick thought. We've talked a lot about changes that can be made, and I think we should be looking at changes, and this is going to be a different election than usual. But I would say this. Sometimes we need to remember, the old congenial host of Wall Street, Lou Rukeyser, used to advise investors. He says, if there's a panic, don't just do something, stand there. And so while we've all emphasized the need to act quickly and act in advance, sometimes we should realize that simply because we have this COVID problem doesn't necessarily mean that every process needs to be changed or turned upside down.
Gene, you want to close this out?
Well, I just want to thank in terms of unmuting. Okay, sorry. I just want to thank all of you. I thought it was a superb panel and appreciate very much each and every one of your contributions. I do think if a lot of our people can address things in the way you guys were all addressing them, I think it will be promising for avoiding some of the more serious problems we might fear.